Welcome to the presentation. I am Becky Floyd, founder of Death Education Central. Today we're going to be exploring the topic of monsters of the modern mind, death, morality, and the Gothic mirror. The first work to call itself Gothic was Horace Walpole's 1764 novel, The Castle of Otranto, later subtitled A Gothic Story. With this, Walpole gave form to a new kind of storytelling, one haunted by mystery, superstition, and the echoes of the medieval past. Gothic fiction became less about monsters and more about what they represented, the anxieties, repressions, and moral shadows of modern life. The term Gothic was borrowed from Gothic architecture, with its soaring cathedrals, crumbling abbeys, and candlelit corridors. These stone labyrinths became metaphors for the human psyche, vast, dark, and full of secrets. Within these decaying walls, reason faltered, and the boundaries between the living and the dead blurred. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Gothic evolved from the old castles of Europe to explore the darker side of human progress. Writers like Mary Shelley, Washington Irving, and Bram Stoker reimagined the Gothic for a changing world, a world shaped by science, empire, and industrialization. In Frankenstein, the terror is born of human ambition and creation. In Sleepy Hollow, it is the haunting of superstition and legend in a new nation. And in Dracula, it is the collision of the ancient and the modern, of the immortal and the decaying. Each story in its own way asks the same eternal question: what happens when humanity tries to master what it cannot control? Life, death, and the unknown that lies between. Born Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin in 1797 to two of England's most revolutionary thinkers, the feminist philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft and the political radical William Godwin, Mary Shelley inherited a legacy of intellectual daring. She was fiercely intelligent and unusually well educated for a woman of her time, steeped in literature, philosophy, and science. At just 19 years old, she wrote what would become one of the most enduring works of Gothic fiction, Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. The story's origin is now legendary. In the gloomy summer of 1816, Mary and her companions, including her lover and soon-to-be husband Percy Bysshe Shelley and the infamous poet Lord Byron, found themselves trapped indoors at a villa on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The sky was dimmed by ash from the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, creating what became known as the year without a summer. Amid the thunder and gloom, Byron proposed a challenge. Each of them would write a ghost story. Mary struggled for days until one night she experienced what she described as a waking dream. In it, she saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. From that vision came the seed of Frankenstein, a story not just of science and creation, but of alienation, responsibility, and the terror of human ambition unrestrained by empathy. Published in 1818, Frankenstein became the first great modern myth of creation gone awry, a Gothic tale that fused the fears of the industrial age with timeless questions about what it means to be alive and what it means to be human. First things first, Frankenstein is not the name of the monster. It's the surname of the creator, Victor Frankenstein, while the creature itself remains unnamed throughout the novel. That absence of a name is deeply symbolic. The monster is humanity's reflection, a mirror of our fears, ambitions, and failures. Too human to be dismissed, yet too alien to be accepted. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a quintessential Gothic novel, steeped in the atmosphere of Romanticism, yet it also marks the birth of modern science fiction. Shelley combined the emotional depth and moral questioning of Romantic literature with the emerging anxieties of industrial and scientific progress. The novel has since influenced nearly every corner of literature, film, and popular culture, spawning entire genres of horror and speculative fiction. The book's subtitle, The Modern Prometheus, draws from Greek mythology. Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods to give to humanity, represents both innovation and defiance. His punishment, to have his liver eternally devoured by an eagle, symbolizes the suffering that can follow when human ambition oversteps divine or natural limits. In Shelley's interpretation, Victor Frankenstein is the new Prometheus, a scientist who dares to create life, only to be destroyed by the consequences of his hubris. The moral is clear. Humanity trespasses at its peril when it tries to seize the powers of creation reserved for the gods. Shelley's novel was a child of its turbulent age, born from the anxieties of scientific experimentation, the disillusionment following failed political revolutions, and the sense of isolation that came with rapid technological and geographic exploration. At the time, real scientists were performing electrical experiments on corpses in attempts to reanimate dead tissue, while explorers pushed into the uncharted Arctic, both of which echoed directly in the novel's pages. Through its countless literary and cinematic reincarnations, Frankenstein continues to hold up a mirror to our own era's fears: artificial intelligence, bioengineering, and the ethics of creation. The story endures because it forces us to ask not only what can we create, but what responsibilities do we bear for what we bring into being? Film director Guillermo del Toro once called Frankenstein the quintessential teenage book, capturing the aching loneliness at its core. You don't belong. You were brought into this world by people who don't care for you, and you are thrown into a world of pain and suffering and tears and hunger. He adds, "It's an amazing book, written by a teenage girl. It's mind-blowing." While most people today know Frankenstein through its many film versions, the story's transformation into popular legend began on the stage, not the screen. As early as 1823, just 5 years after the novel's publication, it was adapted for theater audiences in London. Mary Shelley herself attended one of these early performances, and to her delight found it a pretty good representation of her work. These early plays transformed her philosophical novel into thrilling melodrama, setting the tone for a century of Gothic spectacle. The first film adaptation appeared in 1910, produced by Edison Studios and directed by J. Searle Dawley. This silent short, a mere 16 minutes long, depicted Frankenstein creating his creature in a bubbling chemical vat. The monster, played by Charles Ogle, was a tragic, tormented figure who ultimately vanished when Frankenstein embraced his bride. For decades, this early cinematic relic was believed lost until a collector rediscovered it in 1980, bringing a long-forgotten milestone of film history back into the light. Then came Universal Pictures' 1931 adaptation, directed by James Whale and starring Boris Karloff as the creature. The image that would become iconic: square head, sunken eyes, bolts in the neck. The film's influence was seismic. It was one of the first sound-era horror films, and has since been enshrined in the U.S. National Film Registry for its cultural significance. Wales' sequel, The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935, and Son of Frankenstein, 1939, expanded the myth even further, cementing Karloff's performance as the definitive Frankenstein's monster. Universal's later sequels, from The Ghost of Frankenstein in 1942 to Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein in 1948, gradually shift the story from Gothic tragedy to campy horror comedy. Yet through each retelling, Frankenstein remained the blueprint for modern cinematic monsters, the misunderstood creation born from human overreach and doomed to loneliness. Since then, hundreds of adaptations have appeared on stage, film, television, and beyond, from grim reinterpretations to affectionate parodies. Among the most beloved is Mel Brooks' 1974 comedy Young Frankenstein, a brilliant homage that lovingly resurrects every lightning bolt, laboratory, and laugh from the classic films. More than 2 centuries later, Mary Shelley's creation continues to evolve, part monster, part mirror, reflecting every era's own fears and fascinations back at itself. Washington Irving, born in 1783, was one of America's first true literary celebrities. A short story writer, essayist, biographer, and historian whose wit and imagination helped define early American literature. Born and raised in Manhattan to a Scottish-English merchant family, Irving was the first American writer to earn international acclaim. In an era when American literature was still trying to prove itself, he became its ambassador to Europe, inspiring authors such as Nathaniel Hawthorne, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Herman Melville, and Edgar Allan Poe. He was also admired abroad by the likes of Lord Byron, Charles Dickens, Mary Shelley, and Sir Walter Scott, who saw in him a charming blend of Old World grace and New World originality. Irving passionately argued that writing should be treated as a legitimate profession, not a genteel pastime, and he was among the first to advocate for copyright protections for American authors. When a yellow fever epidemic struck Manhattan in 1798, Irving's family sent him upriver to recover in the quiet Hudson Valley. There, in the misty village of Tarrytown, he encountered the local Dutch customs and eerie folklore that would later inspire his most famous story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, published in 1820. This sleepy hamlet, shrouded in fog and superstition, gave birth to one of America's most enduring myths, the Headless Horseman, a spectral figure who still gallops through popular imagination 2 centuries later. Irving's fascination with the supernatural was shaped not by the Gothic castles of Europe, but by the haunted woods and whispered legends of the early American landscape. In his stories, ghosts and spirits are never far from humor. They serve as moral tricksters, teasing both reason and superstition in equal measure. In 1824, during his time in London, Irving actually met Mary Shelley, who was then 28 and still mourning her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley. Their meeting is a poignant footnote in literary history, a moment where 2 great architects of modern myth briefly crossed paths. Letters suggest that Mary felt a fondness, even affection, for the 41-year-old American, though he never pursued the connection. In many ways, their works share a kinship. Both reimagined the relationship between life, death, and the unseen world, each through the lens of their own nation's anxieties. Through Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle, Irving gave the young United States its first enduring folklore, tales that captured the tension between progress and nostalgia, reason and superstition, life and afterlife. His legacy lies not only in the stories themselves, but in the distinctly American Gothic sensibility he awakened. Irving perfected the American short story and was among the first to root his fiction firmly in the soil of the United States. While he borrowed liberally from Germanic and Dutch folklore, he transplanted those tales into distinctly American settings, riverside hamlets, autumn fields, and forests that seemed to hum with ancestral memory. In doing so, he created the first truly American mythology, blending Old World superstition with New World sensibilities. He also broke new literary ground in his style and tone. Unlike many of his moralizing contemporaries, Irving wrote in the vernacular, using the rhythm and humor of everyday speech. He saw no obligation to instruct or reform his readers. His goal was simply to entertain, to evoke wonder and delight. In that sense, Irving helped establish storytelling as an art in itself, a mirror held up to the American psyche, rather than a sermon for its improvement. Yet his works were far from shallow. Taken together, they form a mosaic of national identity, a series of sketches that both celebrate and question the American experiment. Beneath his wit and whimsy runs a current of melancholy, a recognition that progress often demands sacrifice, and that the past, no matter how quaint, never truly disappears. In his later writings, Irving's moral courage emerged more plainly. He condemned the treatment of Native Americans with a sensitivity rare for his time, anticipating by more than a century the critiques of modern historians. Through his blend of humor, nostalgia, and haunting, Irving seemed to whisper to his readers, "Do not forget who you are or where you came from. The past still lingers, in the woods, in the river, in the stories we tell. It may carry sorrow, but it also carries wisdom and grace." It is this tension between remembrance and renewal, between history and haunting, that gives Irving's tales their mythic quality. Like the headless horseman himself, the past gallops on behind us, refusing to be buried. The final warning of the legend of Sleepy Hollow comes in the form of the headless horseman, a phantom said to be the restless ghost of a Hessian soldier who lost his head to a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. Whether he is truly supernatural or merely a man in disguise is left deliberately ambiguous. In the end, he targets none other than Ichabod Crane, the town's awkward, superstitious schoolmaster. Proof that even small towns have their intelligentsia, and even intellect is not immune to fear. It is the horseman history itself, chasing Ichabod down the moonlit road, the revolution's unburied dead pursuing a man who clings to reason and rules? Or is it simply Brom Bones, the burly local trickster, using fear to reclaim dominance over both man and myth? Irving never tells us. That uncertainty is the story's enduring genius. In leaving the mystery unsolved, Irving transforms a local ghost story into a parable about belief, fear, and the American psyche. Sleepy Hollow becomes a place where Enlightenment rationality collides with folklore, and where the past refuses to stay buried. The tale asks each generation the same question: what do you believe is chasing you? History, superstition, or something darker within yourself? Perhaps, as Irving implies, our answers say more about us than they ever could about him. Abraham Bram Stoker, born in 1847, was an Irish author best remembered for his 1897 Gothic masterpiece, Dracula. Though his name is now synonymous with the vampire myth, In his own lifetime, Stoker was better known as the personal assistant to the celebrated actor Sir Henry Irving and the longtime business manager of London's Lyceum Theatre. He was also a prolific essayist and critic, publishing short stories and reviews while working as a theatre columnist in Dublin before his move to England. Stoker's early life was steeped in folklore and imagination. Born in Clontarf on the north side of Dublin, he spent much of his childhood bedridden with illness, an isolation that fed his fascination with ghost stories and the uncanny. Around him swirled the Irish oral traditions of fairies, revenants, and blood drinkers, tales whispered by servants and storytellers that left a permanent mark on his imagination. In many ways, the Gothic sensibility that would later define Dracula was first kindled not in the castles of Transylvania, but in the shadowed hearths of Ireland. Contrary to popular assumption, Bram Stoker never visited Romania. His inspiration came instead from a fusion of folklore, research, and history. He drew from European myths of the undead, from newspaper reports of blood rituals and plagues, and from real figures such as Vlad III or the Impaler, Dracula, whose name and brutality supply the novel's dark aura. But just as influential were his Irish roots and his lifelong fascination with moral corruption, immortality, and the boundary between science and superstition. Stoker originally intended Dracula not as pure fiction, but as a warning, a story that blurred the line between the fantastic and the real, a nightmarish cautionary tale about contagion, invasion, and moral decay. His publisher, alarmed by its realism, demanded revisions to make the book read as unmistakably fictional. The first 101 pages were excised and later published posthumously as Dracula's Guest. With Dracula, Stoker did more than create a monster. He gave a shape to a myth of modernity. His count embodies both fear and fascination, an ancient evil reborn in an age of science, empire, and repressed desire. He is at once predator and victim, foreigner and mirror, death and seduction incarnate. Today, Dracula endures because it touches a primal nerve, our simultaneous hunger for immortality and terror of decay. Like Shelley's Frankenstein and Irving's Headless Horseman, it reflects humanity's ongoing struggle with the shadow side of progress, the eternal dance between creation and destruction, reason and fear, life and death. Dracula was not the first literary vampire, but it remains the most iconic and enduring. While earlier tales such as Polidori's The Vampire from 1819 and Le Fanu's Carmilla from 1872 both introduced the idea of the seductive undead, Bram Stoker's Count crystallized the archetype into something both ancient and modern, a reflection of fin de siècle anxieties about sexuality, science, and civilization itself. In Stoker's version, the vampire is initially a courteous host to Jonathan Harker, welcoming him into his Transylvanian castle with uncanny civility. Yet beneath that veneer of refinement lurks corruption. As Dracula crosses into England, he becomes the embodiment of contagion, infiltrating polite society, preying upon the innocent, and transforming the pure and desirable Lucy Westenra into a creature of lust and hunger. The novel struck a collective nerve because it spoke directly to the late Victorian fears that society itself was in decline, undone by its own moral and biological weaknesses. Stoker's narrative draws upon contemporary Darwinian theories of evolution, anxieties about degeneration and the shifting terrain of sexual relations, in an increasingly permissive modern world. Dracula's foreignness, sensuality, and virulent vitality stand as a rebuke to a Britain that prided itself on restraint and order, even as those very virtues were beginning to rot from within. At the same time, Dracula is a parable of empire and decay. The Count represents the return of the repressed, the colonized other, striking back at the imperial center. His voyage from Transylvania to London mirrors the imperial trade routes that once carried British influence outward, but now bring corruption home. He wields both ancient superstition and modern technology, telegrams, ships, and blood transfusions, to assert a new kind of power in a world unsure of its own moral authority. The group that ultimately defeats him is a coalition of men and women from England, America, and continental Europe, suggesting that Britain alone was no longer strong enough to vanquish its foes. Stoker's heroes are global, modern, and cooperative, in stark contrast to the isolation of the old aristocratic order Dracula represents. In this way, Dracula touched a collective nerve in its exploration of changing sexual relations, Darwinian evolution, and fading imperial power. It remains both a Gothic horror and a cultural autopsy, dissecting the body of the 19th century to reveal its fears of contamination, decline, and loss of control. And yet, beneath the terror, Stoker offers a strange kind of hope. The cooperation, compassion, and courage might yet redeem a world on the brink of its own darkness. As John Edgar Browning and Caroline Joan S. Picard observed in Dracula in Visual Media, published in 2010, no other horror figure has been replicated, reimagined, or reanimated as often as Count Dracula. He's stalked across more than a century of artistic mediums: film, television, theater, comics, video games, not to mention breakfast cereals, each generation resurrecting him to reflect its own fears and fascinations. Most versions draw less from Bram Stoker's original 1897 text than from its cinematic descendants. Universal's Dracula from 1931 and Bela Lugosi's slicked back hair, evening cape, and aristocratic accent permanently shaped the collective image of the vampire as seductive, nocturnal, and eerily refined. Later, Hammer Studios' bloodier and more erotic interpretations, embodied by Christopher Lee, injected new vitality into the myth, transforming the Count from a distant nobleman into a visceral, predatory embodiment of repressed desire. Through these reinterpretations, Dracula became less a literary character than a cultural archetype, a vessel for changing anxieties about science, sexuality, contagion, and control. His persistence across time mirrors humanity's obsession with immortality, but also our failure to ever truly master death. Each era's Dracula tells us something about itself. In the Great Depression, he was the exotic outsider, draining the life of so-called civilized society. During the Cold War, he symbolized ideological invasion and corruption. In the 21st century, he's often reimagined as the misunderstood anti-hero, proof of our growing sympathy for monsters and blurred moral boundaries. That Browning and Picard found no horror figure more imitated than Dracula is not merely a testament to his popularity, it underscores his mythic elasticity. Like the hero's journey itself, the vampire myth adapts to survive, shape-shifting through time, medium, and morality. In each retelling, Dracula continues to feed, not on blood alone, but on the cultural pulse of the living. Across Frankenstein, Sleepy Hollow, and Dracula, the Gothic imagination performs a kind of cultural autopsy, dissecting the 19th century body of progress to expose the fragile heart still beating beneath it. These stories are not merely entertainments of horror and the supernatural. They are meditations on what it means to be human in an age when reason and industry promise salvation, yet left the soul untethered. In Frankenstein, Mary Shelley gives us the scientist who dares to trespass on divine ground, animating life from death only to recoil from his own creation. Her monster is not evil, but exiled, proof that knowledge without compassion is sterile, and creation without responsibility is monstrous. In Washington Irving's Sleepy Hollow, we meet a different kind of specter, a community haunted not by the dead, but by its own history. The Headless Horseman gallops through the American imagination as both ghost and metaphor, the unburied past pursuing the nation's fragile Enlightenment ideals. And in Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Gothic matures into global myth. The vampire is contagion as empire, as the dark double of modern man, feeding upon the very civilization that fears him. Together, these tales trace the evolution of Western consciousness, from the romantic awe at creation's mystery, through the nationalist ghost stories of the New World, to the fin de siècle panic of science, sexuality, and empire. They remind us that progress always comes with a shadow, and that every enlightenment casts a darker shape behind it. In their own ways, Shelley, Irving, and Stoker each face the same ancient question. How do we live knowing we will die? Their answers are written not in sermons, but in symbols: lightning, horsemen, blood, emblems of power, fear, and transformation. The Gothic endures because it speaks to what reason cannot explain, that death is not merely an ending, but an invitation to meaning. To confront our monsters is to confront ourselves, and in doing so, to glimpse, however briefly, the mythic pulse that still animates the modern heart.